The Centauri Prime Academy's xenobiology department existed in that peculiar space where academic pretension met interstellar bureaucracy, creating something that would make even the most pompous university on Earth seem refreshingly humble. Here, in a lecture hall that cost more than most planetary defense budgets, the galaxy's supposedly brightest minds gathered to discuss the fascinating topic of primitive life forms, with all the enthusiasm of wine connoisseurs describing gas station beverages. Professor Helix Corvain stood at the front of the amphitheater, his crystalline form catching the artificial light in ways that would have been beautiful if he weren't such an insufferable pedant. His species, the Praxians, had achieved faster-than-light travel roughly around the time Earth's ancestors were figuring out fire, a fact he managed to work into every conversation with the subtlety of a supernova. "Today, class," Corvain announced, his voice resonating through the crystal matrix that served as his vocal apparatus, "we continue our study of developmental biology among the galaxy's more quaint civilizations." The assembled students, a menagerie of scales, tentacles, and exotic matter that would have sent human xenobiologists into euphoric shock, dutifully activated their recording devices. Among them sat Othon Scretha, whose methane-based physiology required him to attend lectures in what essentially amounted to a mobile terrarium, and Crystalline Entity 12, who had chosen that designation because apparently even silicon-based life forms weren't immune to pretentious naming conventions. And then there was Penelope Brightwater. Amy, as she preferred to be called, occupied the dubious honor of being the token human in this particular academic circus. The exchange program that had brought her here was less about cultural enrichment and more about the galactic equivalent of a petting zoo. "Look, isn't it adorable how the primitive bipeds try to understand science?" She sat in the back row, partly because the front seats were designed for beings with entirely different skeletal structures, but mostly because she'd learned that proximity to Professor Corvain increased the likelihood of hearing his opinions on human intellectual capacity. "The fascinating thing about lower-order species," Corvain continued, apparently warming to his favorite topic, "is their charming belief that they understand their own planetary ecosystems. Take, for instance, the Terran concept of biodiversity. How wonderfully naive." Penny's pen stopped moving across her tablet. She had been taking notes on Corvain's lecture about evolutionary development patterns across different atmospheric compositions, but somehow the professor had managed to steer the conversation toward one of his regular dissertations on human inadequacy. "Professor," called out Othon, his voice filtering through the atmospheric processors of his environmental suit, "didn't the Terrans recently submit a proposal for ocean preservation to the Galactic Environmental Council?" Corvain's crystalline structure shifted in what might have been a shrug, if crystals could shrug. "Indeed they did. A quaint little document about protecting their water-based life forms. Quite touching, really, like watching children play with toys they don't understand." The lecture hall filled with the alien equivalent of polite chuckles, a sound that mixed harmonic resonance from the Praxians, subsonic rumbles from the methane breathers, and a frequency that made Penny's teeth ache. "Which brings us to today's topic," Corvain announced, his tone suggesting he was about to bestow great wisdom upon his intellectually inferior audience. "Aquatic ecosystems and their role in planetary development. Now, most civilized species recognize that water-based life represents the most primitive form of biological organization." Penny's hand went up, his crystalline form flickered, a sign of irritation among his species. "Yes, Miss Brightwater? Actually, Professor, I'd like to respectfully disagree with that assessment." A ripple of what might have been surprise passed through the classroom. Humans disagreeing with established galactic wisdom was roughly as common as finding a Praxian who didn't mention their technological superiority every 5 minutes. "Oh?" Corvain's voice carried that particular tone professors used when they were about to demolish a student's argument with devastating intellectual precision. "And what possible basis could you have for such a position?" Penny stood up, her human height making her tower over most of the seated aliens, while still being dwarfed by the few who were built on a larger scale. "Well, I've spent the last 15 years studying marine biology on Earth, and I think you might be surprised by what our oceans actually contain. By all means, Corvain said, his form brightening with what passed for amusement among his kind. Please, enlighten us about your charming water puddles. The other students leaned forward with the collective anticipation of an audience about to witness an intellectual car crash. Penny had gained something of a reputation for her peculiar human tendency to question established wisdom, but challenging Professor Corvain on xenobiology was like challenging a black hole on gravitational theory. "I'd be happy to give a presentation," Penny said, her voice carrying a tone that should have served as a warning to anyone who understood humans better than the average galactic academic. "If you don't mind, I'll use some of my research data from Earth's Pacific Ocean." "Marvelous," Corvain replied, settling back into his teaching position with the satisfaction of someone about to watch a student learn a valuable lesson about their place in the universe. "Please proceed." Penny walked to the front of the classroom, connecting her tablet to the lecture hall's holographic display system. The device, designed by a species that had mastered quantum computing before humans invented the wheel, struggled briefly with the primitive human interface, before finally sinking. "I thought I'd start with one of our more interesting species," she said, her fingers dancing across the tablet's surface. "This is a dolphin." The hologram that materialized above the classroom showed a sleek grey form moving through clear blue water with fluid grace. To the assembled aliens, it looked like exactly what they'd expected from a primitive aquatic creature, streamlined, biological, and utterly unremarkable. "Charming," Corvain commented. "A simple marine mammal, I assume? Basic predator-prey relationships? Minimal cognitive function, the usual primitive aquatic package?" "Not exactly," Penny replied, and something in her tone made crystalline Entity 12's photoreceptors focus more intently on the display. "This particular dolphin is named Echo, and she's currently composing what we might call poetry." The lecture hall fell silent, except for the ambient hum of life support systems and the soft whisper of Orthon's atmospheric recycler. "I'm sorry," Corvain said, his form flickering rapidly now. "Did you say poetry?" "That's right," Penny confirmed, manipulating the hologram to show a more detailed view of the dolphin's brain structure. "Dolphins have complex language systems, create art, use tools, and have sophisticated social structures. They're also capable of abstract reasoning, mathematical concepts, and what we might call philosophical thought." The silence stretched, longer this time. "Fascinating," Corvain finally managed, though his tone suggested he found it anything but fascinating. "And this is common among your aquatic species?" "Oh, this is just the beginning," Penny said, her smile growing wider as she watched the professor's crystalline form dim slightly. "Would you like to hear about their technological capabilities?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and every being in that lecture hall suddenly realized they might be about to learn something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of what constituted primitive life. But that, as they say, was just the beginning. The holographic dolphin continued its graceful dance above the lecture hall, blissfully unaware that it was about to become the catalyst for the greatest academic crisis in Centauri Prime's history. Penny stood beside the projection with the casual confidence of someone who had spent years watching supposedly superior beings underestimate both her and her planet, and who was finally about to enjoy the inevitable reckoning. "Technological capabilities," Professor Corvain repeated, his crystalline form now flickering with what his species euphemistically called heightened intellectual curiosity, but which looked suspiciously like barely contained panic. "Surely you mean tool use in the most basic sense, perhaps the manipulation of sea vegetation for nutritional purposes?" "Actually, I mean echolocation systems that put most of our sonar technology to shame," Penny replied, manipulating the hologram to show detailed acoustic waves emanating from the dolphin's melon. "Dolphins can echolocate objects buried in sand, determine the internal structure of other creatures, and communicate across distances that would require our most advanced communication arrays." The assembled students shifted uncomfortably in their various seating arrangements. Othon's atmospheric recycler wheezed slightly faster, and crystalline Entity 12's photoreceptors dimmed in what might have been deep thought or existential dread. Furthermore, Penny continued, clearly enjoying herself now, they've developed a three-dimensional language system that incorporates sonic imagery, emotional context, and abstract concepts. When a dolphin says fish, it's not just identifying a food source, it's creating an acoustic picture that includes the fish's size, species, emotional state, and approximate location. Preposterous, Corvain sputtered, though his voice carried less conviction than it had moments earlier. No aquatic species could develop such sophisticated communication without the neural complexity that comes from terrestrial environmental pressures. Oh, but they did, Penny said, switching the hologram to display a dolphin's brain structure alongside a human brain for comparison. Notice the increased surface area in the neocortex, the expanded temporal lobes, and the unique structural adaptations for processing acoustic information. Their brains are actually more complex than human brains in several key areas. The lecture hall erupted in what could generously be called academic discourse, but sounded more like a collective nervous breakdown conducted in 17 different languages. The Praxians began resonating at frequencies that made the crystalline walls hum ominously, while the methane breathers produced sounds that suggested their worldview was undergoing rapid structural collapse. But surely, Corvain interjected, his form now flickering so rapidly it was giving several students motion sickness, this is merely instinctual behavior refined through evolutionary pressure. Complex seeming but ultimately mechanical responses to environmental stimuli? Penny's smile could have powered a small starship. That's what we thought too initially. Then we started studying their cultural practices. The word cultural hit the classroom like a photon torpedo to the academic ego. Several students began making notes with the frantic energy of beings who suddenly realized their dissertations might need significant revision. Dolphins pass knowledge down through generations, develop regional dialects, create games that serve no survival purpose, and engage in what can only be described as artistic expression, Penny explained, the hologram now showing multiple dolphins engaged in synchronized swimming patterns of bewildering complexity. They also demonstrate what we call signature whistles, unique acoustic identifiers that function as names. Names? Crystalline Entity 12's voice cracked slightly, which was impressive given that silicon-based life forms rarely showed emotion. Individual names chosen by each dolphin and recognized by their pod, Penny confirmed. They also have names for locations, weather patterns, and abstract concepts. Some dolphins have been observed creating new whistles specifically for human researchers, essentially giving us names in their language. The silence that followed was so complete that the ambient hum of the lecture hall's environmental system seemed deafening. Professor Corvain's crystalline form had stopped flickering entirely, frozen in what appeared to be a state of academic shock. But the really interesting part, Penny continued, because apparently she hadn't traumatized her audience enough, is their understanding of interspecies communication. Dolphins have been observed modifying their behavior specifically to interact with humans, whales, and other marine species. They demonstrate theory of mind, the understanding that other beings have different perspectives and knowledge sets. Dolphin's atmospheric suit made a sound that might have been a whimper. Theory of mind is considered a hallmark of advanced consciousness across all known species. Exactly, Penny agreed. And dolphins demonstrate it more consistently than most sapient species. They also show evidence of planning, abstract reasoning, and what we might call empathy. There are documented cases of dolphins rescuing humans from drowning, protecting them from sharks, and even assisting in human fishing operations without any apparent benefit to themselves. The hologram shifted to show a dolphin gently nudging a human swimmer toward shore, and the image seemed to crystallize something in the minds of the assembled aliens. This wasn't just intelligence. This was intelligence coupled with what the galaxy's most advanced civilizations like to think of as their unique capacity for altruism. The acoustic imaging capabilities alone, Penny continued, mercilessly pressing her advantage, suggest that dolphins experience reality in ways that most species can't even conceptualize. They can literally see inside other creatures, understand internal emotional states through biorhythmic analysis, and process environmental information at speeds that would overwhelm most computer systems. Professor Corvain finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled harmonic that suggested his worldview was undergoing catastrophic structural failure. But they're aquatic. They haven't developed space travel, advanced mathematics, or interstellar communication systems, haven't they? Penny asked, her expression innocent in the way that made professors across the galaxy break out in cold sweats. How do you think they've been coordinating migration patterns across entire ocean basins? How do you suppose they navigate using stellar positions while submerged? And what makes you think they haven't been listening to our radio transmissions? The question hung in the air like a dark star, sucking all the light out of the room. Every being in that lecture hall suddenly realized that they might have been operating under some very dangerous assumptions about what constituted primitive life. Listening to our transmissions? Crystalline Entity 12's photoreceptors flickered rapidly. Are you suggesting that these dolphins are aware of interstellar civilization? I'm suggesting, Penny said, her tone now carrying a hint of something that might have been warning, that any species capable of processing acoustic information at the level dolphins demonstrate would naturally be curious about electromagnetic radiation patterns, especially patterns that clearly indicate organized intelligence. The lecture hall erupted again, this time with the sound of minds collectively reconsidering everything they thought they knew about Earth's significance in the galaxy. But underneath the academic panic, a more troubling thought was beginning to take root. If dolphins were this sophisticated, what else had the galaxy's civilizations missed? And more importantly, what were they going to do about it? The academic composure that had taken the Centauri Prime Academy centuries to cultivate was disintegrating faster than a cheap hyperdrive in a solar storm. What had begun as a routine lecture on primitive aquatic life had evolved into something approaching an existential crisis, complete with the kind of intellectual panic that made tenure-track professors question their life choices. Professor Corvain's crystalline form had dimmed to roughly the brightness of a dying star, while his students exhibited various species-specific signs of distress. The Andromedan delegation had begun secreting stress pheromones that made the air recyclers work overtime, and somewhere in the back row, a gaseous entity was literally losing molecular cohesion. Perhaps, Corvain managed, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone clinging to the last fragments of their worldview, we should focus on the fact that these dolphins remain confined to their aquatic environment. Surely their intelligence, however surprising, is limited by their inability to manipulate their physical surroundings in meaningful ways. Penny's expression suggested she was about to deliver another intellectual haymaker. Actually, Professor, that's where things get really interesting. Dolphins don't just use tools, they manufacture them. The hologram shifted to show a dolphin carefully selecting a piece of coral, then methodically shaping it with precise movements before using it to extract food from crevices. But that was just the warm-up act. They also engage in what we might call aquatic agriculture, Penny continued, her tone carrying the casual confidence of someone who had spent years watching supposedly advanced beings underestimate her species. Some dolphin pods cultivate specific types of algae, manage fish populations through selective predation, and even maintain what could be called underwater gardens. Othan's atmospheric suit was now making sounds that suggested its occupant was hyperventilating, which was impressive given that methane breathers typically had excellent respiratory control. Agriculture implies long-term planning, resource management, and an understanding of ecological balance. Exactly, Penny agreed. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Dolphins have been observed coordinating these activities across multiple pods, sometimes spanning thousands of kilometers of ocean. They're essentially managing marine ecosystems on a continental scale. The lecture hall's environmental systems struggled to process the sudden spike in stress-induced atmospheric changes. Professor Corvain's form flickered with what might have been the crystalline equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Continental-scale coordination requires sophisticated communication networks, Crystalline Entity 12 observed, its photoreceptors now pulsing erratically. Are you suggesting these dolphins have developed something analogous to our quantum communication arrays? I'm suggesting, Penny replied, that when you can generate acoustic signals that travel through water at frequencies that penetrate oceanic layers, coordinate with the planet's magnetic field, and bounce off the ocean floor to reach other continents, you've essentially created a biological communication network that spans the entire planet. The silence that followed was so profound that several students began checking their auditory systems to ensure they were still functioning. The implications were staggering. Not just that dolphins were intelligent, but that they had developed a form of planetary communication that rivaled anything the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had achieved. Furthermore, Penny continued, apparently determined to completely shatter every preconception in the room, recent studies suggest that dolphins have been monitoring human space launches for decades. They demonstrate behavioral changes that correlate with satellite deployments, and their migration patterns have shifted in ways that suggest they understand orbital mechanics. The phrase orbital mechanics hit the classroom like a gravitational wave. These weren't just intelligent sea creatures. They were intelligent sea creatures who apparently understood concepts that most galactic civilizations considered advanced physics. But surely, Corvain interjected, his voice now carrying the desperate edge of someone watching their life's work crumble, this is merely coincidental behavior, pattern recognition without true comprehension. Penny's smile could have been classified as a weapon in 17 different star systems. That's what we thought too. Then we started analyzing their acoustic signatures during space launches. The hologram shifted to show complex waveform patterns, and even the non-technical students could see that these weren't random sounds. The acoustic signatures showed clear mathematical relationships, harmonic progressions that suggested not just observation, but analysis. They're not just watching our space program, Penny explained. They're commenting on it. These acoustic patterns contain what appear to be mathematical calculations relating to orbital velocity, gravitational effects, and trajectory analysis. In essence, dolphins have been providing mathematical commentary on human space exploration for the past 30 years. The lecture hall erupted into chaos. The Praxians began resonating at frequencies that made the walls vibrate ominously, while the methane breathers produced sounds that suggested their entire understanding of galactic hierarchy was undergoing rapid recalibration. "Wait!" Othan's voice cracked through his atmospheric suit's speakers. If dolphins understand orbital mechanics and have been monitoring space launches, what's their assessment of human technological development? Based on acoustic analysis, Penning replied, they appear to be amused. The word amused detonated in the collective consciousness of the assembled aliens like a cognitive bomb. Not impressed, not confused, not concerned. Amused, as if dolphins were watching humanity's space program with the same benevolent entertainment that adults might show when watching children play with toy rockets. They're amused by space travel? Crystalline Entity 12's voice carried a note of something approaching hysteria. But space travel is the hallmark of advanced civilization. It's the defining characteristic that separates primitive species from galactic citizens. Apparently, Penny said, her tone now carrying a hint of genuine sympathy for her traumatized audience, dolphins don't consider leaving your planet to be particularly impressive when you've already mastered living in harmony with it. They seem to view space exploration as a rather inefficient way to accomplish what they've already achieved through ecological integration. The implications crashed over the lecture hall like a tsunami of existential dread. If dolphins considered space travel to be primitive, what did that say about the galactic civilizations that had built their entire identity around their ability to traverse the stars? There's more, Penny continued, apparently determined to complete the intellectual demolition. Dolphins have been observed creating what appear to be three-dimensional maps of local stellar formations using bubble patterns and current flows. They're not just aware of interstellar space, they're modeling it. Professor Corvain's crystalline form went completely dark for several seconds, and when it reignited, it was with the dim, uncertain light of someone whose entire worldview had just been fed into a black hole. Modeling stellar formations, he repeated, his voice hollow. Without instruments, without mathematics, without leaving the ocean, Penny finished. It turns out that when you can process acoustic information at the level dolphins demonstrate, you can essentially echolocate off atmospheric pressure changes, magnetic field variations, and gravitational effects. They're using the planet itself as a massive sensing array. The lecture hall fell silent except for the sound of minds collectively reconsidering everything they thought they knew about intelligence, technology, and the nature of advanced civilization. And in that silence, a single terrible question began to form in the collective consciousness of the galaxy's supposedly most advanced academic institution. If dolphins were this sophisticated, and if they found galactic civilization amusing rather than impressive, what exactly had the galaxy's advanced species been missing about the nature of true intelligence? The answer, as they were about to discover, was more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. The emergency session of the Centauri Prime Academy Student Council convened, with all the dignity and gravitas of a group therapy session for beings experiencing collective psychological trauma. The council chambers, normally reserved for weighty academic matters like budget allocations and curriculum disputes, now hosted what would later be remembered as the most intellectually dishonest gathering in galactic educational history. Crystalline Entity 12, serving as the emergency session moderator, pulsed with the erratic lighting patterns that indicated severe cognitive dissonance. Around the circular chamber, representatives from 47 different species sat in various states of academic distress, their worldviews having been systematically dismantled by a single human marine biologist and her insufferably intelligent dolphin. The emergency session will come to order, 12 announced, its photoreceptors dimming to what passed for professional composure among silicon-based life forms. We are here to address the dolphin situation. The phrase, dolphin situation, hung in the air like a confession of intellectual bankruptcy. These were beings whose civilizations had mastered faster than light travel, quantum computing, and interdimensional physics, and they were holding an emergency session about Earth's aquatic mammals. "I move," declared Othen, his voice filtering through his atmospheric suit with the strained quality of someone who had spent the last hour questioning everything he thought he knew about intelligence, "that we implement immediate protective measures regarding Earth's oceanic ecosystem." Protective measures? Penny's voice carried the incredulous tone of someone watching supposedly advanced beings lose their collective minds. She had been invited to the emergency session as a relevant expert, though her presence seemed to make everyone profoundly uncomfortable. "We must consider the implications," interjected an Andromedian delegate whose stress pheromones were making the air recyclers work overtime. "If these dolphins possess the capabilities described, they represent a potential threat to established galactic order." "A threat?" Penny repeated, her eyebrows rising in the universal human expression for, "Are you seriously this stupid?" "They're marine mammals who've been living peacefully in Earth's oceans for millions of years. How exactly do they threaten galactic order? They challenge fundamental assumptions about technological development," Crystalline Entity 12 explained, its form flickering with what might have been embarrassment if silicon-based life forms were capable of shame. "Their existence suggests that our metrics for measuring advanced civilization may be incomplete." The euphemism incomplete was doing more heavy lifting than a neutron star's gravitational field. What they meant was that dolphins had revealed galactic civilization's entire understanding of intelligence to be embarrassingly provincial. "Furthermore," added a Praxian delegate whose crystalline form was resonating at frequencies that suggested extreme agitation, "their apparent amusement at our achievements implies a level of intellectual sophistication that we are not prepared to acknowledge." Penny stared at the assembled beings with the expression of someone watching a group of Nobel laureates argue about whether the sun was too bright. "So, your solution is to what exactly?" "We propose," Othon announced with the solemnity of someone delivering a momentous decision, "a comprehensive ban on all contact with Earth's oceanic environments until such time as we can develop appropriate protocols for interaction with aquatic civilizations." The silence that followed was so complete that several species began checking their auditory systems. Penny's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally settled on the kind of bewildered amusement that humans reserved for watching aliens do something spectacularly stupid. "You want to ban Earth's oceans," she said slowly, as if speaking to particularly dense children. "Not ban," 12 corrected, with the pedantic precision of someone trying to make an insane idea sound reasonable. "Implement protective quarantine measures to prevent inadvertent cultural contamination." "Cultural contamination," Penny repeated, her tone now carrying the dangerous edge that humans developed when their patience finally snapped. "You're afraid that dolphins might contaminate galactic culture by being too intelligent?" "We're concerned," the Andromedan delegate clarified, "that exposure to alternative paradigms of technological development might destabilize existing social structures." The translator struggled with the euphemisms, but the meaning was clear enough. They were terrified that other species might start questioning why they had spent millennia developing space travel when they could have been developing the kind of deep ecological integration that dolphins had achieved. "This is insane," Penny declared, her voice cutting through the chamber's artificial atmosphere like a laser through tissue paper. "You're holding an emergency session to ban an entire planet's water supply because you can't handle the fact that dolphins are smarter than you thought. We are implementing reasonable precautionary measures," Othon protested, though his atmospheric suit's recyclers were working so hard they were producing audible whines. "Reasonable?" Penny's laugh had the quality of someone watching a particularly absurd comedy routine. "You've just discovered that Earth's oceans contain a sophisticated civilization that's been peacefully coexisting with humans for millennia, and your response is to declare them off limits because they make you feel intellectually inadequate." "The motion is on the floor," Crystalline Entity 12 announced, apparently deciding that the best way to handle Penny's inconvenient logic was to ignore it entirely. "All in favor of implementing protective quarantine measures for Earth's oceanic environments?" The vote that followed would go down in galactic history as the moment when the galaxy's most advanced academic institution officially acknowledged that they couldn't handle the existence of intelligent dolphins. 43 species voted in favor, 3 abstained, and 1 voted against. A Centaurian delegate who later claimed she had been confused by the translation protocols. "Motion carries," 12 announced with the hollow triumph of someone who had just won a contest they should have been embarrassed to enter. "Earth's oceans are hereby classified as a quarantine zone pending further study." Penny sat in stunned silence for several seconds, processing the fact that she had just witnessed the galactic equivalent of a group of adults voting to ban the playground because the children were too good at games. "You do realize," she finally said, her voice carrying the weary tone of someone explaining obvious facts to willfully obtuse beings, "that dolphins probably already know about this conversation?" The chamber fell silent, except for the ambient hum of life support systems and the gradually increasing whine of Othon's atmospheric recyclers. "Their acoustic monitoring capabilities," Penny continued, "mean they've likely been tracking our communications since the Academy's transmitters came online. They probably know more about galactic civilization than most of the beings in this room." The implications hit the assembled delegates like a collective slap to whatever passed for their faces. Not only had they just voted to ban Earth's oceans, but they had done so while being observed by the very beings they were trying to quarantine. "In fact," Penny added with a kind of smile that made professors across the galaxy break out in cold sweats, "based on their behavioral patterns, they're probably finding this entire proceeding absolutely hilarious." As if summoned by her words, a low-frequency harmonic began resonating through the chamber's communication systems, a sound that every being present suddenly realized was coming from Earth's oceans, transmitted through the Academy's own monitoring equipment. It was, unmistakably, the sound of dolphin laughter. The emergency session dissolved into chaos as 47 different species simultaneously realized that they had just been intellectually outmaneuvered by aquatic mammals who had been listening to their panic attack in real time. The galaxy's most advanced academic institution had managed to ban an entire planet's water supply while being mocked by the very beings they were trying to quarantine. And somewhere in Earth's Pacific Ocean, a pod of dolphins continued their eternal dance through the waves, amused by the antics of the galaxy's advanced civilizations and secure in the knowledge that true intelligence had never required leaving home to prove itself. Meanwhile, Penny walked out of the emergency session with the satisfied expression of someone who had just watched the galaxy's most prestigious academic institution vote to ban water because fish were too smart. She made a mental note to include this incident in her next report to the Terran Marine Research Council, right under the section titled "Why Humans Still Have Job Security in Galactic Academia." After all, it turned out that in a universe full of beings who could traverse the stars but couldn't handle the existence of intelligent sea life, sometimes the most advanced species was the one that never felt the need to prove it.